studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Lloyd Blankfein is here. He is the chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs. He has served in that role since 2006. He steered his firm through difficult times, most notably the global financial crisis in 2008. This week, Goldman Sachs is hosting the North American Energy Summit in New York City. It takes a look at how the country can be environmentally responsible and also profit from the North American shale revolution. I am pleased to have Lloyd Blankfein back at this table.
Thank you, Charlie. Good to be here.
Now, you work without a jacket, correct?
I am right now.
Tell me about this summit, because everybody's excited about the shale revolution.
Yes.
You know, and so what does it mean? How fast is it coming, and what will it change?
Well, a lot is going to change. When you think of the U.S. being as close as it is to energy sufficiency and not having to be a net importer of energy, and you think of the history of the last 40 years, since the Arab oil embargo, when it really was driven home how dependent we are on foreign oil, and all the way the history unfolded over the last 40 years. Could you imagine how different things would have been over the last 40 years? And you can project forward and imagine how different it will be over the next generations if we can get this right and make North America energy sufficient, both in terms of the economy and in terms of, the geopolitics and America's position in the world. It's quite a blessing, but the benefits of that blessing don't just come automatically. We actually have to do things so that we can take advantage of it.
And so what do we have to do?
We have to reconcile the schism between the people who are only thinking in terms of the environment, the people who are only thinking in terms of supporting the economy, and get some sort of accommodation between the two, both of whom are right. But it's not a question of one wrong, one right. Both are right, but accommodation has to be reached so we can go forward and have rules that are durable and reliable so people can make the kind of long-term investments that allow us to receive the benefits of the energy situation, and those benefits are growth and jobs.
We'll talk about that, but I mean, in terms of rules, Congress makes the rules that you're talking about?
Congress, states, there's a lot of competing jurisdictions. Are we going to be exporters of LNG? Are we going to keep the LNG in this country, which will drive the price down in this country, which will allow manufacturers and users of energy to make the long-term billions of dollars investments in plants that may only receive a return after 10 years or more? Or are we going to distribute it overseas, in which case it will go and lower the price of energy around the world, in which case there's no particular incentive to move your businesses to your manufacturing businesses to the United States. Licensing, being able to get these things going, pipelines, which are not an unbridled good because they raise certain environmental concerns which are legitimate, but but if done well, properly regulated, and if it doesn't take a lifetime to get those things off the ground, we'll get the benefits in our lifetime.
You're in favor of the Keystone project?
No, I'm favor, and which brings us to the point of this conference, which is to bring a lot of interests together who have strong opinions and get them to engage in a constructive dialogue so we can reach an accommodation among these various...
You don't want it to be against and for, but you want it to be, how do we find common understanding?
Exactly. We'd like to be an honest broker, a catalyst, if you will. Personally, I think we can have pipelines and do them in the right environmentally sensitive way, get the benefits of the boon to the economy, and at the same time take advantage of make sure they're done in a way that that does it in an environmentally safe way. But in fact, you have to do both of those things. It's not a winning game. It's kind of a get-along game. If either side, if the people who are only interested in the economic growth argument got their way on everything, who would make a long-term investment without thinking in the back of his or her mind that, gee, will this regulatory regime be stable into the next administration, or will this be reversed? Similarly, if you were making a bet that you'll never be able to develop these energy resources or transport these energy resources, who would make a bet on the basis of that? I think you have to have a compromise between the two, not so much because splitting the baby is a wonderful thing, but because it's the only thing that ultimately will be stable in the long run. And, the point to make here is that the benefits of these investments can only be realized after a long period of time. But once you make the investment, you can't withdraw from the investment.
And to make a huge capital investment, businesses have to be able to have certain rules that they can exist within,
and
so that there is a stability, so that they can expect
once you make an investment like this,
takes place over a number of years.
Once you make an investment like this, you may be locked into that investment for decades. But every day you could decide to defer that investment day by day. So the path of least resistance is to defer the investment decision. It's hard to make the investment decision. You'd want to know that the rules set under which you're laboring and investing will pertain for a long time.
So should one role of government be, both governments around the world, try to create an environment in which you have rules and regulations and economic opportunities so that it's an incentive for business to invest?
I think an incentive, but again, you have to take account of the fact that, we not only want to invest, but we want to leave the right kind of world to our children also, and we want to be able to breathe and have clean water and a good lifestyle. And so it's not, you want to incentivize people to invest in sensible projects that are done in the most environmentally safe way.
Has that happened over the last 25 years?
I think we're stepping in the right direction. For one thing, there's another element that has to be achieved. People have to agree on the facts, or agree on a band of facts, so that so for example, there's arguments back and forth of how much more environmentally friendly natural gas is. Well, if you burn natural gas, of course, it's more friendly than burning oil. But if you don't transport it properly and you don't take it out of the ground properly, then it releases methane, which is a lot worse than oil. So the answer would obviously be, let's gauge natural gas with a set of rules regarding its development and its transportation that's done in a way that doesn't allow methane to escape. And those rules have to be put into place.
And you're convinced they can do that if, in fact, everybody focuses and does what's necessary and has the right rules, it can be done so it's environmentally
safe. I think that's right. And if one side manages to get permitted without those requirements, that's a very hollow victory, because in the long run, you're going to have to do it in the right way. So you might as well have the rules set so that you and your competitors have to do it in the right way now, so that, again, you can make that investment into a durable investment.
How much power does Goldman Sachs have in terms of Washington and being able to see the kind of rulemaking it wants, that it thinks is advantageous for whatever motive?
Sure. Well, all our power, we have influence, but it's, in a kind of geopolitical terms, it's the softest of the soft power, the softest of the soft influence. We lend our voice. We're like a university also, as you know. We have research people on the macro side and the corporate side, and what we do is we put out ideas, we defend our ideas, we are provocative, we show initiatives, but at the end of the day, we don't have the power to execute.
But it's mostly because the research and the analysis is mostly because you want to see the way it works and where the world is going, so that you can make reasonable decisions with a fair understanding of the risk.
Sure. At the end of the day, all of our activities, the success of all of our activities correlate with growth in GDP. We're in favor of growth in GDP, sustainable growth in GDP. Right. It does us no good to have a spike in growth and then to have everything become discombobulated and ineffective and not go forward. If you want to have the best projection of the fortunes of Goldman Sachs going forward, I'd ask you, well, where's GDP growth going to be? If it shrinks, then we're going to shrink at a multiple of that. Yeah. If it grows, we're going to grow at a multiple of that. So, yes, we're interested in growth, and we're interested in the benefits that flow from growth, like jobs creation. We're financiers of activity. If you want to know, in total what we do, we have good relationships with the people who need capital, and we have good relationships with pools of capital. And what we do is we analyze the needs, and we validate it by going out and raising money for them, either by lending them money or financing, sometimes using our own capital, sometimes doing an IPO. And that validation will draw in investors who think we're good at identifying those opportunities.
Has anything changed about the businesses that you're in, just the description you just engaged in, as a consequence of the recession that we went through in 2008?
Well, I think there's a lot more focus on us. There's a lot more regulation. There's a lot more oversight. There's a lot more process both internal to Goldman Sachs and external to Goldman Sachs, making sure that things are well complied. That, for example, when we go out and validate something through an investment, that we're very transparent about what we do, rules that govern what we can say about certain things at certain times, making sure that both sides of an issue are explored. So, in other words, yes, there's more process and there's more scrutiny, oversight, but basically the substance of what I said, what our role is in the world as an intermediator, as an intermediary between people who need capital and the big pools of capital, that's been pretty, that role has been a necessary role for thousands of years of financial history.
Talk back about this conference that you're having and what might come out of it. How fast will the shale revolution come on stream? When will we see the consequences of energy independence?
There's a number of consequences that we can see. So one consequence already, with the state of regulation as it is, with the ambiguities that exist, you can see part of the revolution has already been felt. There's a lot more energy becoming available, both oil and natural gas. And, we're well on our way, again, not being independent because we don't necessarily have the right kind of fuel and don't necessarily have it in the right places, but towards energy sufficiency. And generally when we talk about this, we don't just talk about U.S., we talk about North America and the continent, which brings up the question of whether you ship it down from Canada into the United States, which is currently receives most of the exports from Canada. And so on the production side, we're seeing that already. What we need to right now, it's production over consumption. What's lagging now is not the ability to get it up out of the ground. What's lagging is using it. And so, and it's an interesting thing. It's not necessarily intuitive, but when you go out and you frack and do these activities and pull it up, you can turn it around and sell it very quickly. Your return on investment occurs very quickly if you're the developer, if you're the producer.
Right.
If you're the consumer and you have to go out and plan and build a factory, a chemical plant for a couple of $1 billion or more, that you may not get that return on investment for 10 years or more. And so there you have to have a wide runway of seeing ahead and seeing that, the price is going to be low, it's going to be stable, what the rule set is going to be. So really it's much easier to develop and to produce it, and that's why those statistics rise. What we're not really seeing is the plants and the manufacturing jobs come from it. And I think that's where the rules and regulations set come in.
But the shale revolution will affect not only us, it'll affect China. They will have their own shale capacity.
Sure. And by the way, our shale capacity, to the extent that we're taking more natural gas and oil out of the ground, it means we're importing less from the Middle East. China imports more oil from the Middle East than we do. There's a million reasons why we have a lot at stake in the stability of the Middle East. But one of them had to have been the fact that it was a major source of our energy supplies. To the extent that we're not the major importer of that oil, but rather oil from that region is going to China, you're going to see other powers in the world have a stake in the safety of those sea lanes.
Will it diminish the influence of, say, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries that have that are either oil or gas rich?
It may not diminish. Well,
and Russia?
Well, there's still, don't forget, there's a race. There's more supply coming, but there's more demand coming from these emerging places. I think the thing that's most stark is not so much there'll be demand that'll match the new supply, but it'll be different customers. And that's going to have geopolitical consequence.
Who are the new customers?
The new customers will be China.
Yeah, of course.
And other emerging markets.
Well, they just signed a big deal with Russia.
Absolutely.
For 30.
And, those people, the Russians and the Chinese were rivals in a lot of ways. And now then they have to transact, and it's in both their interest to do so. The Russians are looking for new markets, and the Chinese are looking for sources of supply, and we're not competing for sources of supply in the same way because we have our own supply. Those are some of the geopolitical consequences that will develop over time.
How far out into the future do you think you can see?
Well, I'm in the risk management business, so I don't take it for granted that I could see behind. I don't think I could see 4 inches into the future. Yeah. I'd say that most of my...
Yeah, but your firm has a reputation of being pretty good at understanding the future and being able to make some analysis as to about what risk to take.
Well, I'll confess to you that what I think we aspire to is less foresee the future and more be a great contingency planner. And sometimes if you contingency plan really well and you can respond very fast to what's happening because you thought through all the possibilities, you can get off the mark so quickly it looks like you false started. It looks like you anticipated the start when all you've really done was listen so closely and knew what you were going to do that you got off the mark quickly. I think it's hard enough to predict the present. You know, think about it, perspective. It's very hard to step out of your context and see what is happening. I have views about the future, but I'll tell you, we're not in the business. You wouldn't be a very good risk manager if you let what you think was going to happen have too great an influence on what you plan for and protected against. What we really do is we really contingency plan. What might happen, what could happen.
What is your core competence?
Personally?
Yes.
You know, I think I am. I think I have. I am a highly functional paranoid, and if I've overstated, it's on the highly functional part. I'm sure I'm a paranoid.
Paranoid about what?
Well, I have to worry about stuff. You know, listen, when the phone rings too late at night or too early in the morning, I'm going, oh my God, what happened?
I don't want to answer.
What is somebody? No, I have to answer. Yeah. And in fact, if it stopped ringing, I'd call everybody I knew at work to find out what I missed. No, I spend about. I have the unhappy life of having to spend about 98% of my time worried about the 2% worst contingencies.
And when you look at the world today, how has it changed most dramatically in the last 10 years for you?
Well, for me,
the role that you have.
Well, I can't think. I've been a CEO of Goldman Sachs for 10 years and president for 3 years before that. So my last 10 years it's not much of a conversation without talking about my role at Goldman.
Yeah, but I mean, my point is whether the world that Goldman exists in has changed so that what Goldman does today is dramatically different from what it did in any way because of changing global circumstances.
No, the firm evolves. So I would say if you go back a dozen years, and not much more than that. Mm-hmm. We were a small firm, much smaller firm. We were a much more domestic firm. We were 15 years ago, we were a private partnership, which was, and a small firm without a lot of access to the capital markets. Since that time, we became a public company with a lot of access to public markets and therefore a larger balance sheet. And there, I'd say one of the biggest differences is we were always in the business of giving advice. As a result of having our balance sheet and being able to raise capital ourselves and having a much bigger balance sheet, we can not only advise people on what to do, we can help them execute more. In other words, we could provide the financing. Right. That's a very big difference. And as the world has developed and grown in the growth markets, we've grown with it. 15 years ago, the CEO of Goldman Sachs didn't have to go to China 2 or 3 times a year, or India every year, or Brazil, or some of these countries. And as these countries have grown around the world, a lot of what we do, I started the conversation by saying that a lot of what we do, the success that we would have correlates with growth. And so naturally we chase growth around the world. We not only chase growth that exists, but we try to drive growth wherever we go.
I asked you this morning, I mean, if you look at the global economy, there's a kind of recovery going on. There's a recovery around the world. At the same time, everybody talks about we need more growth. And the question is, why have we not had more growth, and what do we need to do to incentivize growth?
Well, we've had, we're having growth. Look, we had a very big shock. We had a financial shock, which has other consequences associated with it, because when you have shock to the financial system, there's an aversion, there's more conservatism, people accumulate cash and financial. We've seen look, we're in a situation now where interest rates around the world are hovering around zero, and in some cases dipping below zero, and people somehow can't find enough opportunity to take cash that's offered to them at no cost and deploy it.
And why is that?
Because
why is that?
Well, I think sentiment is, people make a mistake. Look, they give a Nobel Prize in economics, but it's still not a hard science. And you're dealing with sentiment and people. Right. And, when sentiment changes...
In fact, people have won Nobel Prizes for measuring the sentiment
They measure it exactly and do statistical analysis of it. But the fact of the matter is, you can have a change in sentiment, and from one minute to the next, it not only changes your worldview, it erases your memory of what you used to think. People entered into '07 very, very enthusiastic and buoyant. They left '07 kind of very depressed. Look at the sentiment. By the way, it's not just the economic system. Look at the sentiment in Washington, the poison politics that exists now. We got there, and we can get out of that situation. That's where, very often...
But I mean, the core question for me is, and I asked you this earlier, as I said, is what is necessary to give the confidence for those people who can get money at a zero interest rate and have already a lot of money in the bank and they're not spending it? Is it because they're unsure about the future?
Yes.
What is the threat to the future that they worry about?
No, look, we just started to have recently, after low level of activity for a long time, we just had a wave of M&A.
Right. I know.
So I'll just...
A lot of it in my business.
Right. I'll just describe a scenario with you. People are sitting and watching and waiting, and nobody wants to take any risk, and every time something goes wrong, you want to kill the person that made the mistake because it's such an aggressive and poison moment in time. Then but everybody's sitting on record levels of cash and sitting. Yeah. Somebody does a deal. Oh my God, I wish I had done that. Yeah. And now I'm thinking, yesterday I was thinking, boy, it's really risky if I do something. Now somebody else did something, got applauded. Hell, I'm a CEO. Yeah. I better do something too. It's risky if I don't do something.
Exactly.
And so I'm just describing to you how sentiment can suddenly change, and people look for that. So record levels of cash weighing, and you could say on the one hand, well, why aren't people using it? But at some point, somebody will come along and say, and people are doing this. Yeah. There are activists who are going and say, listen, you have so much cash. If you don't use it, then return it to your shareholders and let them use it. Then all of a sudden people say, I better do something.
That's just what happened at Apple.
And that, and that's something that you could see going on in a lot of places. And so sentiment can shift, and because it hasn't shifted, and by the way, when it does shift, no one will remember that it was different a week earlier. Just people's mindset shifts.
Why does it shift?
Again, we're talking about, the human condition. I'm telling you the spark. By the way, these are topics that people have ruminated about forever. Why is there a business cycle? Don't you know that the trees don't grow to the sky? So why should you be surprised when they don't? Doesn't everybody know? So interest rates are hovering at very low levels now. Does everybody know that eventually they're going to mean revert to a higher level, that interest rates are not going to stay just above zero once consensus reaches the conclusion that the economy is growing and the demand for money increases? Nevertheless, will people suffer big losses and be shocked at them when interest rates go up?
Yes.
Yes. Why is that? Why will they be shocked?
But does that mean you remain, notwithstanding how much you are a paranoid, an eternal optimist, because you know that interest rates are going to go up?
Well, I would say, listen, separate thing. I have been doing this long enough, and in general, and look, I don't know just the things in front of me. I actually know about World War II, even though it happened before I was born. I know how history and flows, and things tend to, people think one thing and then they revert back again. And, I get things won't be the same when things are really, really good for a long time. By the way, it's not unrelated. There's a reason there's a cycle too. When things are going really well, despite their best efforts, people get complacent, and complacency sows the seeds of the next crisis. And how many times have people said, and no matter what you say to yourself when the next crisis strikes, how many people saying, boy, I missed the opportunity to buy that waterfront property when we had the last turn down in real estate problems.
How many people went out and bought a lot of waterfront property in 2008?
And by the way, but the very next time it happens, I'm going to do it because I'll remember. Well, the next time that crisis happens, your knees are going to be knocking together louder than anybody else's, and you won't do it. That's why you have these cycles.
But see, this is fascinating. So what is it? I mean, what is it that makes us not willing to, when we know things are going to get better from 2008, it is not going to go down forever. We know it's going to come back. And let's say, why don't we do more? Or is it only the smart ones who do more at that time?
That's why Warren Buffett does so well, and that's why it sounds so simple after you've heard it.
Well, he always says he buys at a time in which the days are the worst.
It seems that he manages to do that. And by the way, he writes op-eds about it when he does it. So it's not that he's it's not that he's doing this in a subterfuge.
So you took $5 billion of his money, didn't you?
I borrowed it. Yes. I wish I had taken it, but unfortunately, I had to give it back.
But I mean, why did you make the deal? Because you needed the money, or you needed the idea of his confidence?
I needed both. The fact of the matter is, a number of people came to us afterwards. Now, this was the week after Lehman Brothers. when everybody was fretting about whether the capital markets were open, and this was before TARP, and we did a transaction with Warren Buffett, as you say, which we did a preferred, sold and preferred, and got $5 billion, and the very next day did a common equity deal in the market, so the markets were open to us. And with Warren's money, we got more than just money. We got the validation of somebody who's regarded as a terrific investor, and somebody who knew our firm, and that was an important imprimatur from him. People called us up afterwards and said, "Gee, I would have done that." And I said, "Well, that would have been great, but with you, I would have just gotten money." With Warren, I had something that was more important. And by the way,
a lot of people who said to me at the time when he made that deal, "I would have made that deal." You know, I mean, anybody would have made that deal, which means that he is a very savvy negotiator as well.
Let me tell you, this negotiation took about 35 seconds.
Is that right?
Yes.
He defined the terms, and you said yes.
And you know something? They were reasonable terms for the risk he was taking at the time.
How frightened were you in 2008? Because Tim Geithner writes about fear in your voice, he said.
Well, I was we were very nervous. And I tell you, you were either, if you were alive, you were nervous.
Yeah.
It would have been, he also wrote that, and that's absolutely true. People say, oh, gosh, would you, look, obviously, we were able to borrow money and do transactions on our own, so it wasn't the capital markets were closed, and you never know. But when I could tell you, we insure against risks in my business. You insure risks, I'm sure, in your personal life that are 2% risks, 1% risk. Was the risk of a cataclysm, was a risk of a failure that would have affected us and could have caused our own failure? Was that only 2% or 4%? It didn't have to be. You know, people are going back and forth. Oh, people are saying, oh, I'm sure the systemic risk wouldn't have gotten to a level where there would have been a series of dominoes and failures that would affect everybody. Well, what do you mean you don't think it would have happened? You mean it was less likely than not? It was less than a 50% probability, 30% probability, 20% probability? When you think about what was at stake, how much of a risk as a probability would it had to have been for you to pay a big price to insure away that risk? And I think that the regulators and the official sector did a very good job. And of course, they'll get excoriated for it. Why are they going to get excoriated for it? Because the world didn't blow up. But it didn't blow up because of
they took the measures they took.
Because they took the measures they took. If they hadn't, and do you have to get into this debate about whether the world would have come to an end or not? No. How about that there was some more than insignificant possibility? Wasn't that enough when you're responsible for the safety and soundness of the financial condition of the country and the planet? That to me is enough of a threshold for you to take the steps that they took.
So you think Paulson and Bernanke and Geithner made essentially the right decisions?
I think they made great decisions in the fog of war with what they know. There's no doubt in my mind that people writing their dissertations from some carrel in a university library somewhere will say, oh, gosh, they should have gone 3 degrees more left or 4 degrees to the right.
Should have made a better deal with
Or they should have made it better, or driven this, or driven that, or they should have waited another week.
Or AGI.
But in the time, given the moving parts and the times that they had to do, and by the way, the courageous decisions that they made, knowing that they were going to get criticized, I think it's pretty petty to fault them for ways in which it might have been marginally better.
And have we improved the system so it's unlikely it could happen again? Or will it always happen again because people grow from crisis to confidence and overconfidence?
I think both are right. I think we've improved the system a lot to make it a lot less likely and to make it a lot costly to the people who are involved in the crisis. But at the end of the day, the definition of enough time, the definition of infinity, is that it's not that everything can happen, it's that everything will happen. Yes. And so given enough time, everything will happen. And look, some of the things that we've implemented that makes the world safer from, let's say, the 20-year storm, the 20-year event, and actually makes it more dangerous for the 50-year storm. If you make everybody go to a clearinghouse, it'll make it less likely that a moderate problem will cause a financial, because everybody will have the safety and protection of a guaranteed clearinghouse. But what if you have an event that's so big that it puts the clearinghouse in jeopardy? Yeah. The once every 50, And so I think you have to do everything. You have to, you have more vigilance, more regulation, more rules, more oversight, more consequence if that fails to achieve the right result, and a way of digging yourself out of a situation if all else fails, in a way that protects the public the best. But if you're asking me, could I imagine scenarios in which, we get into difficulty again? when in his, the world, unfortunately, this is not a new phenomenon. When you're dealing with credit, don't forget, currency in the financial markets are by fiat. Things are worth value because I assert it and you believe it.
Right.
When people stop believing things, look, at the end of the day, if a company has a crisis, if an oil tanker gets grounded, or leaks happen, and you question whether the company is run well or not, and you pull up to a service station, and the gas is 2 cents cheaper there, will you buy the gas? Of course. Do the infrastructure, the materials, the plant, the equipment, are they still there and still valuable? Sure. But in a financial institution where I make payments to you because I'm getting a payment from somebody else, and if somebody somehow doubts your solvency and the payment that I have to make doesn't come in from the other side, you get a kind of a domino effect and a chain reaction because it's all confidence. And that's why financial institutions and financial markets are different than everything else. We have a Federal Reserve System. Some people call into question whether we should. But there are central banks in the world and a Federal Reserve System in the United States because everyone always thought there needed to be a lender of last resort. When confidence gets shaken, there has to be an institution big enough and a balance sheet big enough to say, I'm going to put the question of confidence out of reach.
Well, that's exactly what they did.
That's exactly what they did. And if you take that away...
And that's exactly what the central bank did in Europe.
That's what they did in Europe. And you know something? People will say, my God, did we need to do that? Should we have done it? It worked, and so now you can quibble because it worked. But if we hadn't do it, we might be in an entirely different situation. And by the way, why do we have a Federal Reserve System? Because we had a panic and a problem like this for... every few years in the 19th century. And, I think gone are the days when the banker J.P. Morgan could stride onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and say, I'll buy 10,000 U.S. steel, and everybody says, oh, my goodness, we're saved. The world is too big for that. The balance sheet of the world is too big for that now, and it takes a big balance sheet like a government to take care of it. Nobody should rely on it, and people should be punished if they ultimately do need to rely on it. But taking, but anyway, that's...
But, I mean, here's what's interesting to me, too, as you talk about that. I'm also thinking about the fact that China went from double-digit growth to expectations of around 7%, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But it now has the largest economy in the world.
Or close to it.
Close to it.
Yes.
What's going to be the consequence of that?
Well, you can look in the worst terms, the U.S. has a competitor. In the best terms, there's another locus of...
The U.S. has a market.
Has a market. And look, in a way, GDP and growth is like increments to GDP is like increments to oil. If they found oil anywhere in the world, of course it's wonderful for the country that discovered it. But that oil that then gets added to the world supply, it reduces the price of oil anywhere, because all things being equal, you add supply and demand stays the same, the price goes down for everyone. It's a windfall for the country that sources it, but it benefits everyone. Same thing with GDP. If China grows its GDP and the Chinese get richer, of course it's a wonderful thing for China. But what will they do with their riches? For some percentage of their riches, they'll buy goods and services they'll buy iPhones. Goods and services that the United States produces, and that'll be good for us too. So whenever you add a resource into the world, a commodity, whether it's energy or wealth, it's good for the person who really acquires it, but ultimately it trickles across the world and is good for everybody.
So it's not a zero-sum game.
No, it's not a zero-sum game. When wealth gets created, the financial system in this country and globally does two things. It helps to generate the wealth, and it serves to distribute it. And so wealth created anywhere in the world gets distributed, because how do people manifest the benefits of wealth? They buy things. Some of the things they'll buy from us. If they're not buying enough from us, maybe it's because they have restrictive policies and we have to fight that, or maybe it's because we're not competitive, we don't make things that they want, in which case we have to blame ourselves.
So then take me to emerging markets like Brazil. What happened to them? Because, I mean, your own guy, coined the term BRIC. And so, therefore, when emerging markets came along, he said to me at this table, I mean, one characteristic of an emerging market is a developing middle class. Mm-hmm. Yes? What happened so that their growth has stalled for Brazil and some other emerging markets? Well,
it's stalled, but I wouldn't, it's not petered out. I wouldn't bet against it. I mean, with when something is new and something is fresh and someone's growing at a fast rate off a low base, you're going to get a lot of volatility. Look, the 20th century was an awful...
And you create a new buying class.
You better new buying class, and it goes in fits and starts, and, it gets overextended, and then it consolidates. It could go backwards. Look, the 20th century was a great century for America. But every year wasn't a great year for America. Panic of '07, the Great Depression, 10 years. And something, it was an awfully good century. But we had a lot of bad years in that. So I think if you walk away from Brazil now in 2014, you may lose the last 86 years of their century.
But when you look at China in terms of what they're doing, there are those who argue, back to your energy summit, that North America, if in fact the shale revolution takes place as we hope, and all the developing industries and all the jobs, will have an economic engine that will drive the global economy more than Asia.
No, it's not a competition. We'll help drive the global economy, and they'll drive the global economy.
There are metrics here, aren't there?
Yeah, well, let's look at it this way. The United States, people are debating how fast is the United States growing. And some people say, gee, it's growing at 2.5%. Some people think it's growing at 3.25%. So that's 0.75% that people could be quibbling about on our economy, $15 trillion economy. Well, Chinese economy, as you said, is almost the size of the U.S. economy, and there we're debating about whether it's growing, at 5% or 8%.
Yeah.
That's a bigger difference. In other words, and again, when you look at growth that gets added to the world, the consequences of China getting it right, and by the way, 5%, they could go south of it, or they can go north of 8 too. But the consequences of them getting it right or wrong sooner rather than later is actually a lot more growth added to the world than what people are debating about is realistic for the United States. So it's very, very consequential, and that's why people are keeping an eye on it. And with China's entering into another phase now. Before, they were going for growth at all costs. And so growth at all costs.
And add pollution.
You run those factories, you keep them going, and right next to the city, and you keep going. At some point, you decide, you're rich enough so that you want to breathe.
And they had an input of new money, and therefore they had a lot of corruption too, which are
a lot of corruption, a lot of things. And look, when things are growing quickly, and they they build 80 airports all at once, they may put a few of them in the wrong place.
Yeah. But at the same time, when their standing committee makes a decision, they carry the decision out. I mean, state capitalism can work.
It can, but I think that they have, I think behind the scenes, and we're not as privy to it, I think they have as much, debate and dissension and unruliness as we have. And in other words, from where we're sitting, it all looks so monolithic, and isn't that wonderful and easy? I just decide what to do. I can tell you how it works in our shop. I may be chief executive officer, but I also have to cajole and beg and and be of course you do.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot more. Maybe democracy is the wrong word, but there's a lot more. Difference of opinion and input that goes on in China than necessarily that we see. Maybe it occurs within the party, maybe it occurs behind closed door, but, they have to,
They have arguments in the standing committee.
They have arguments too, sure.
Yeah. In fact, they have to build coalitions like everybody else.
Like everybody else.
Every other place.
Like everybody else.
So we live in this global economy, and you and I have talked about this before, in which we've seen more wealth than we've ever seen before. Mm-hmm. Lots of people are writing books and having conversations about income inequality. And they're concerned about the consequences of the top 1% perpetuating itself and getting richer and richer. And there is a division so that all boats are not rising.
Sure. Well, I'd say that recently, first of all, this has been going on for 30 years. That there's been, and by the way, that doesn't relieve us of the problem. That just compounds the problem that has been going on for decades, where the richer have grown richer faster than the poor has been catching up, and that's obviously a problem, and that's a destabilizing thing. I'm not sure I understand all the reasons why. And look, anything that exists, I can offer an explanation, but if you give me the explanation, I wouldn't have predicted where we'd be. But I'd say, at a point in which there's great technological change, in addition, when you have a flat world where whoever makes the best product, everybody buys it from him. When anybody offers cheap labor, everybody goes there and manufactures. You get a kind of more of a winner-take-all kind of a world, and that's created the schism that we're seeing. But it's something that is bad for everyone because it's destabilizing.
Okay, I understand all that, but I mean, at the same time, I mean, take a look at this. I'm going to give you a couple of clips from people who've been on the show recently, and you know both of them, or at least you know one of them. Christine Lagarde talking about the IMF and making income inequality a policy issue. Here it is.
We are looking at income inequality because we believe that it is macro-critical. In other words, it's raising a point where it really can have a destabilizing and detrimental impact on the growth of economies and on economies in general. So we've done two critical studies, in my view, because we are looking at it not from a political or ideological angle. We're just trying to understand the facts and the relationship and the correlations. And the two studies are, one, is inequality, excessive inequality, hurting growth? And the answer seems unambiguously yes, it's hurting sustainable growth. And the second study we did, which goes against conventional wisdom, is redistribution policies, if adequately articulated. So is our redistribution policies a brake on growth, which was conventional wisdom. Everybody assumed for a long time that if you do redistribution, then people will not be attracted to producing more, earning more, doing more, because the more is going to other people.
You admire her.
I admire her, and again, she's defining the problem. I'm not hearing a solution in it. If you want, you know what I think the best redistribution.
That's exactly what I want to know.
The best redistributive policy would be. Now, obviously, we have a progressive tax system. Right. But one of the best redistributive policy is for us to spend more money and have an effective educational system. That would be a great redistribution. In other words, take tax revenue, of which I pay a higher percentage, and poor people pay zero,
and be willing to pay more,
and use it to educate everybody, which I won't take advantage of because my kids go to private school. That's a good redistributive system.
Why don't we do that?
I don't know.
But a lot of other people believe that unless people like you and the government and others come together, we will not get our hands around income inequality. Listen, and we cannot.
We're very, look. It's okay, cliche that, gee, people in business like myself, we're big plutocrats, smoking big cigars, trying to misrate the population. It has a little bit of it. Yeah. The fact of the matter is,
you're talking about problem solving.
I feel this. No, again, I feel this very strongly. I think it's a shame that our education system is in the shape that it is. We started the conversation talking about energy. There are things that we can do. The poison politics make it very hard to legislate. I would love to see legislation done that would let us take advantage of the blessing that we've been handed, lower our energy costs, and revitalize manufacturing and the jobs that come with manufacturing in this country. I'd like to see that happen. I think that would help. The situation.
This is not a cute question, but I mean, are you doing everything that you know how to do to push those ideas forward?
I am. Are you? Of course I am. I mean, right now I'm talking to you.
Yeah, of course, exactly. But I mean, I do think these are important questions. I really do.
I
don't think we're getting our hands around them enough. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is this gap between rich and poor growing, and are we doing enough, in a sense, to find ways through education and lots of other means so that so many people are not falling below a certain line.
We publish on that topic. I have one vote. I've been clear and shrill on these policy issues.
Do you think I'm being naive?
No, I don't. Come on. No, you're not naive. But I think it is, a bit of, a cliche. We must think, because we're in the capital markets and bankers, we must think in a certain kind of way. And I know you know it. We've worked together on certain of these projects, and you know where we are in these issues. It's a little bit of problem with our political democracy right now. That we can't get certain things done.
Reform the tax structure, do a whole range of other things.
We can't pass tax legislation. We can't
make
energy legislation. How about immigration? How about immigration reform, where people may want to come to this country because it's a beacon and people want to start their businesses. The most talented people in the world want to start their business, create jobs, and we can't do that. There's a lot of problems. And by the way, I'm not blaming a single person or thing. It's a little bit.
Nor am I.
Yes.
But I mean, I'm just saying, are we doing enough? Is my point. I mean,
Well, if
but
we
I think
haven't resolved it, then we're not doing enough.
on the issue of I mean, immigration, clearly, we can't get immigration reform, and nobody, the Republicans don't want to talk about it right now because they don't want it as a midterm issue because they want to talk about other things, as they've effectively said. So it won't be a big issue in the midterm election.
Well, just telling you, again, I'm going to try to be, in the interest of neutrality, I would say that there are other people who don't want to talk about to some people, immigration is policing the borders. To some, it is reuniting families.
But it ought to be both. It ought to be both.
Right, exactly. So one side wants to talk about one side, the other side wants to talk about the other thing.
Exactly.
I think immigration is something that can be done because you know what? We can actually do both. And so that's a rare moment when we can actually get things done.
And we can allow people to have all the benefits of entrepreneurship,
right,
and at the same time make sure that too many people are not falling in the cracks.
Absolutely. So,
and education is one way, but there are other ways.
Right. And so, if you getting back to your question, and I don't want to get too far away, are we all doing enough? We can all do more. Listen, personally, and getting back to the thing, I'll tell you what we spend a lot of time doing. We spend a lot of time investing and financing industries that otherwise might not get financed in order to create jobs and create that virtuous circle where people do that. That's in our business life and our personal life. We get to these, and I'll tell you, in my political life, I vote in favor of all these things that would, that would lift people out of poverty. I try to, but it's a problem, and it's hard to point the finger at any one thing without pointing it at everything.
I mean, most people that I know, most of the people I know, like you, and I think you're rare, and I really do believe you're rare, but most people really want to see a better country. They differ in terms of how they want to see the country better.
Everybody is right. You put a lie detector on everybody else, everybody would say, I'm only interested in what's good for the United States, and people could be saying the opposite things, and they'd both be true. Listen, politics starts in this country, not when somebody's wrong and someone's right. It's when everybody's right as they see it, as their context allows them to see it. Charlie, we talked about this. I grew up, my dad was a mailman. I grew up in the projects.
Replaced by a machine.
Yeah, he was. He was. Well, I once told you the story that when I went, the only time I visited my father at work, he was a mail sorter in the post office. He, and when he left, they replaced him with an automated mail sorter. But what I thought was poignant was that they had that machine for 10 years, but they had a policy of not replacing anybody, but only doing it by attrition. So they could have put that machine in, and yet they kept him in that seat doing something that a machine could have done faster and better for 10 more years. And then when he left, they put the machine in his place. And how's that for productivity?
Did he work overnight because they gave a small percentage of a premium for working overnight?
And they when you sorted the mail in those days, and it was done by hand, you did it. Obviously they collected the mail by day, sorted it by night, and delivered it the next day. So yes, he got paid a 10% night differential.
And your mother was a secretary for a security firm or burglary.
Right. Well, because that was the burgeoning industry in my part of Brooklyn.
That was the growth industry.
That was the growth industry in my part of Brooklyn. Was the burglar alarm industry.
You made it to the top of Goldman Sachs because why?
Well, there's a lot of and this goes to the heart of the other question, which is why everybody should be sympathetic to to when other people aren't performing. I would say, yada yada. I worked hard. I applied myself. I did errands. I got paid. I worked hard. But guess what? I was also lucky. I fell in with people who gave me good advice. I went to a good firm, and where it worked out well. My firm I worked for didn't go bankrupt. It did well, and I climbed up a letterhead. People took an interest in me, and it all worked out. Now you could be super smart, and somebody won't take an interest in you. Or you could be super smart and someone takes an interest to you, or it's a bad industry that doesn't pan out. In life, you have to be good, but you have to be lucky too. So I think people have to remind themselves of that too, because it makes you a little bit more empathetic for the misfortunes of others.
And are you still attracting to Goldman Sachs the Lloyd Blankfeins?
Well, we're attracting pretty good people to Goldman Sachs, whether it's Lloyd Blankfein or not. Don't forget, Lloyd Blankfein wasn't very attractive to Goldman Sachs.
They didn't hire him.
They didn't hire me. I got in by, I tried to get hired by Goldman Sachs, but they wouldn't have me.
But you were hired by a firm that
I joined a firm that was acquired, and that's how I came in. I came in sideways.
Yeah. How long do you want to do this?
This interview? I could go on forever.
We could go on.
Yes.
No. How long do you want to be CEO of Goldman Sachs?
I don't. it's like right now, and when things are going well, and even with doing this interview, no kidding aside, it's a lot of fun. I think about the influence I have, the people I get to meet, and I say, gosh, I want to do this for a long time. And then when things are really, really bad and I'm getting, pressured and attacked and I see caricatures of myself in the newspaper, I think to myself, God, I don't really want to do this, but my sense of responsibility requires me to go on. And so when things are going well, you love it. When things are going poorly, you can't leave anyway. And so it's a very hard thing to get away from.
And you're optimistic about the future.
Also, they're hard to get, these positions, so you don't want to get away. Once you stop doing it, you don't come back again. So,
if it's not this one, where the hell am I going to go?
What am I going to do?
Would you work in government, in the public sector?
I don't think people are clamoring to have me do that.
Well, they may not now.
But if by some freak of...
Go ahead.
Look, by some freakish reason, if I thought there was a good opportunity and I can make a difference and do something good, of course I would.
Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for having me, Charlie.
Pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
Bud Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, thank you for joining us.